What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today I've got a big one. We are taking a look at an entire Conquest run, all the way from Proving Grounds, this game, through Silver and Gold and Infinite Conquest. We're going to take a look at the whole run, and I'm going to break it down. A lot of people have liked this content in the past. It's going to be a little bit more informative than just entertaining. There's a lot to fit in here. This was like 2 hours worth of gameplay crammed into a 1 hour-ish video because there's a lot of cool things that happen in 11 Conquest matches of Marvel Snap. So to kick things off, I see the Panopticon, and I decide to play Makari actually spending the energy, which I thought was at least interesting to kick this video off with. We are in the Proving Grounds here, so we are going to snap back on turn 3. My opponent already snapped on turn 1. I was waiting to see if I drew anything good because I've got Darkhawk and my opponent isn't playing an Arishem deck. However, there is Clintar in this game, so I can throw my Darkhawk into Clintar on turn 4. That will lock it in for 11 power, though it is a little bit weaker because the Abbey drew my opponent a card. So that means that they are going to have 2 less power on this Darkhawk here, but I do still think I've got enough to take my opponent, and that's partially going to be because I wind up drawing Blob on the 5th turn of the game, so that allows me to have a lead in all 3 locations before my opponent Shang-Chi's my Darkhawk symbiote. So now I'm actually behind by a little bit, but I think I can still catch up here and grab the win on the final turn by battling for all 3 locations with Miss Marvel, plus just like some random junk in Clintar, but it's just enough random junk that I will be able to grab that bonus from Miss Marvel, and I will also get 6 more power into the Panopticon. My opponent finishes this off with a second Shang-Chi, one from Loki, assumedly, and then one from just having it in their own deck. And then we do actually lose in the Panopticon, but Miss Marvel also gives me an additional 5 power over in the Abbey, which is going to be just enough to grab the win. This game was a little bit dicey. I was in for 4 cubes because I had Shauna to help me win the raft. However, Jean Grey definitely complicates some things here because I've got to play to Baxter building first, and Mobius is making it so that I can't just play like a Mockingbird on the cheap and then play Shauna to fill the raft. I'm kind of scared that my opponent is going to kick Silk out of the raft, which will then mean I'm going to have a more difficult time filling that location. But I draw Rogue on turn 6, which is really great because my Mobius costs 4 from the icebox, so I can't play that into Baxter building, but I can Rogue hit either the Sarah or my opponent's Mobius, and then Shauna over into the raft, and because I have priority, that will mean that Silk won't be able to move out. I was just like double checking, making sure that that is what I wanted to go with, but then I realized, wait, no, I do have priority, so I can go for this play here. Rogue, I actually really do want to hit Mobius. That is a huge hit because now I can play my Mockingbird and we turn off my opponent's Sarah, whereas if we stole Sarah, it actually just would have done nothing. Speaking of doing nothing, I get Arnim Zola from the raft. Not actually a huge deal, but what is a pretty big deal here is just my power lead on this game. I think this opponent just decided they were going to play it out, win or lose, and obviously lose in this case. We drop 18 power on the final turn, and they're only battling for the raft here, so they really did not have a shot. I think the card that people make the most mistakes with, either in District X games or Arishem games or whatever way it randomly gets generated, is Jean Grey, because people aren't really used to playing with this card. We have it in this next game, so I'm going to try to pull off some cool stuff with it. And we also have, once again, Darkhawk plus Clintar, which is a really good combo. Again, my opponent not on Arishem, so it won't be insane, but it will still be really good. There are some different things that I can do with Jean Grey already. I can play it into Clintar, and then I'm going to play my Darkhawk into Clintar, and then that'll merge. And that will kind of disrupt my opponent a little bit because they'll be forced to play into that location. but I actually think there's a better use for it, which is just to play Darkhawk into Clintar, make a winning lane, and then play Jean Grey elsewhere, so that way my opponent can't like Shang-Chi my Darkhawk symbiote. So that's the idea that I'm going for here, and even though I have 5 energy this turn, I'm not going to play anything. I briefly consider making the Jean Grey play still, and I could have also used Quake in some capacity if my opponent like had played into Tinker's Workshop or something, but I definitely don't want to switch Time Theater and Clintar and destroy my Quinjets, even though those are getting destroyed regardless. But I still think I'm in a reasonable position here. Things definitely just got a lot worse. Seeing that my opponent is on a destroy list is a little bit awkward, but the main awkward thing here is that my opponent is going to draw 2 cards with Nico, which is going to shrink my Darkhawk before I can turn it into a 15 power symbiote. So that is also really awkward, and I think from here I really only have one play. I'm not that far ahead in Clintar. You'll see this is actually an 11 power Darkhawk. So I think I just have to go for Loki and try to steal some of my opponent's big payoff cards. And awkwardly, I don't actually get anything good here, but my opponent doesn't know that, and they wind up retreating on the final turn. This is definitely one of the strengths of Arishem that I didn't really talk about in my intro to Arishem video, but it is one of the benefits of playing with a bunch of RNG. If you don't know what's in your deck and what's in your hand, then your opponent, no way they can predict you either. This was a little bit more reliant on Loki specifically, and them not knowing which cards we grabbed from that, and I think that that is one of the strong points of Loki too, just the unknown that he brings and the uncertainty that he gives your opponent, but definitely a strength of Arishem, and we'll see that come into play in some later games as well. This game, my opponent snaps on turn 2. They've got the turn 1 Deadpool. Isle of Silence is stopping a lot of what I'm working with, and I don't really like it, so let's go to the next one. And here we are in the next one. All I've done so far is play Namor, but this might be the spiciest Supergiant that you're gonna get. This is a really, really good Supergiant. Supergiant's just great against Destroy specifically because it's going to prevent them from destroying X-23 on turn 5. And then they can't use that extra energy on the final turn to set up and do a bunch of stuff. But what is really cool here is my opponent is going to use a Shang-Chi on my Namor, which is beautiful for me. We also wind up disrupting their Nico with this Supergiant, and now we can sneak in a huge Phoenix Force and my opponent won't know about it. And then I'll also be able to play some other cheap cards with Cloak and Wasp that'll get some additional power here from Xandar. I do decide to play out my entire hand here just because I felt like 2 hidden cards in the center could really keep my opponent guessing, and my hand isn't that great beyond that. But the other thing that I did have was Rogue without priority, so I would have been able to 50-50 and potentially grab my opponent's Null as well, and I was probably winning in the vault. So I liked my odds in that one, and let's see what happens in this one. We are first going to Shang-Chi their Monster Island, which they've destroyed with Venom, and then I'm gonna snap and drop a Null as they Nico Shang-Chi my Nick Fury. Now this is a little bit scary because now we know they have another Shang-Chi. They've told us as much, and because of that, that makes me think they're going to play that Shang-Chi into my Null, so I think this is a pretty clear just Arnim Zola on the Null, though I also could have just seen battling for Nidavellir this turn by playing a few cards into that location. Could I have won in Nidavellir? I don't know, actually, if I could have. I could have played Wolverine plus Carnage plus Hitmonkey into Nidavellir, or I could have gone Carnage plus Wolverine plus Hitmonkey. So either of those would have won Nidavellir. I think that that was maybe a better play, but I do have priority with Arnim Zola, which does open up an interesting opportunity to, well, just make a big null. And I get a little bit scared because my opponent played a face down card into Monster Island, and if that's the Shang-Chi, I'm kind of boned. I will actually win on differential still, even if that was Shang-Chi into Monster Island, because Shang-Chi would have tied Shang-Chi and then I would have had an even bigger null, but either way, we get the victory. So now we are into the gold conquest, and I'm going to kick this off with a red Guardian on my opponent's Quinjet in an Arishem mirror, and Sokovia with a random discard, but unfortunately it hits my Ghost Rider, which is super annoying because I was looking for some type of random discard effect to make this Ghost Rider work, and unfortunately we are not going to have that. We do have Kiln though, and I can drop a Darkhawk into that location and basically guaranteed to win that. We also have Arnim Zola or Ultron to add more power into that location, but specifically, even if my opponent has a Darkhawk, we beat it because we're already up by 3 power in that location. So feeling good about this game so far. My opponent just used their Darkhawk, which means they don't have Darkhawk for Citadel, so my second Darkhawk should definitely be able to win that location, and especially when I also have a Leech. It's just going to wind up being a 2-cuber as my opponent does retreat to the Leech effect, but we definitely had them in this one. This game was a little bit unfortunate, but I did think it was worth spending the extra cube to see if my opponent had the Shang-Chi. They already had so many other sweet cards. They had Blob, Darkhawk, my Darkhawk, that I figured they might not also have a Shang-Chi, but they did. I think I would have won if they didn't, but it was worth a cube. In the next game though, they get super unlucky as a Sakaar on turn 1 gives my opponent Havoc, and from there I snap, I'm just going to take a cube. There's no way they can get out of that. On to round 4 here, where we get a pretty good use out of our Heimdall by moving everything out of Shuri's lab so we can get some additional points into the Superflow. However, my opponent also stole my Heimdall with White Queen, so this success is going to be a little bit short-lived, but on turn 5 I'm just going to drop Orca plus Mr. Sinister, and then on the final turn of the game I'm going to use that Arnim Zola to move out of Superflow because I am no longer winning in that location, and I just moved that War Machine around, but that's going to be enough to grab the win in both of the other locations. The Icebox makes my Agent Coulson cost 4, so everything cost 4 except for Swordmaster. I decide I'm going to play Swordmaster. Hopefully it won't hit Loki or Nick Fury, and then we can use either Nick Fury or Agent Coulson to restock my hand, which is also kind of why I like playing Swordmaster here. I can get a whole bunch more options with Nick this turn, so that's what I'm going to go for. I will just play that into Eternity range. Actually, I play Agent Coulson. I guess I just felt like it was better on the curve because next turn I will have 5 energy. So yeah, that's fair enough. Meanwhile, my opponent is going to Loki. So I do have a decent idea, at least, of some of the cards that they might have. They decided to play their Quicksilver rather. That was probably a mistake, and we can hopefully punish them for that by making every location Sinister London. And now they've got 2 dead cards on the board, the Rock and the Quicksilver, and they're going to fill it up with some more cards. Leech is a reasonable amount of power though, despite the fact that it kind of gunks up my hand. It's a little bit awkward. Now I can't Shang-Chi, which is definitely something you'd like to be able to do in a Sinister London game. However, I can put a lot of power out on this board while ignoring both Rogue and Shang-Chi. So I think I'm kind of good. I'm just going to play War Machine, and then I'm going to play Mockingbird, and then on the final turn of the game, I'll be able to play Mockingbird for free next turn, but I think I should still go for it here. I think that's fine. I think I also have a big enough of a lead in Sinister London that I should play War Machine there. My opponent winds up playing nothing because everything is so discounted with Quinjet that they're going to be able to throw everything down on the final turn, and I only get to play 1 card here. I could just play White Queen as a 4/6 and dodge Shang-Chi. I decided to play Super Scroll because I felt like the only way that my opponent can realistically catch up here is with a Darkhawk, and now if they have Darkhawk, then I'm battling right back. Turns out they don't have that. They are just going to play some mediocre cards. They couldn't retreat. It was the final cubes here. So there was nothing my opponent could do. They just grabbed bad cards off Loki, and I dodged Shang-Chi, and they didn't really have any options. In my second gold conquest match, I make kind of a sus move here. Have to play into Avengers Compound this turn, and I was kind of just hoping my opponent would play Blob on this turn, and I would be able to Shang-Chi it, which would help me fill the Avengers Compound for Ant-Man next turn, and then I would still have Rogue for Darkhawk, which is what I wanted to cast into Murder World anyways. I wind up still staying in this and thinking maybe I've got a shot, but ultimately I think it was a bad play. The thing is, I don't think my opponent can win Necrosha without playing basically their entire turn committed to that location, which means I should be able to grab the win in Murder World and Avengers Compound. So I liked this theory. I forgot to play around my own cards though. My opponent Loki'd me, so they have Arnim Zola, so they're able to Arnim Zola a huge Darkhawk into both of those other locations and take the win. Gotta shake it off though and see if we can come up with anything better for this one. I use Nova to get into Vormir, and my opponent has not played a card at that location. So currently, they're probably going to have a tough time getting into Vormir, which means we should just be able to win that location for free, assuming they don't play it into it this turn with the Sandman. They kind of can't. So I think that we're looking pretty good here. They could play like small card plus Darkhawk into Vormir, but aside from that, I think that we're covered. And I can use Rogue to steal Blob, which I think is good, but I don't think it's going to be enough power in Sokovia. My opponent's they've got a really big Blob and a pretty large Sandman too. So our Blob would have to be for 21 in order to grab the win in Sokovia. So I decide to undo this and actually just Rogue center, hoping that they play Darkhawk there or Mystique, which we can then steal with Rogue, and I think that we're actually being competitive in Wakandan Embassy for right now. Shang-Chi, that one would have got me, so glad that we don't have to play around that. And then Rogue, let's see what it is. It'll be pretty. It doesn't even have to be big. It'll be, as long as it's for 15, then it'll grab us the win. So there we go. We take them back for 4 cubes. This game gets a little bit spicy. My opponent throws down an early Blob into Wakanda, which is good for dodging Shang-Chi. However, there are still ways that we can interact with that Blob, so that's what we'll be looking for. And actually, we're just going to be competitive with my opponent in Wakanda and actually make a really tough thing for them to deal with too by quadruple Nomura-ing, which is going to give both of my side locations plus 20 power. They can Shang-Chi the Kraven, but they can't Shang-Chi the Nick Fury. So we do have a lot of power in Wakanda. This isn't that much power in Bar Sinister. I mean, it's reasonable. 24 power. There's a lot of 6 power cards, a lot of 5 power cards in this deck too. One thing I'd potentially be worried about is like a free Mockingbird coming out and winning Bar Sinister for my opponent. And then we're going to just try to disrupt my opponent the best that we can on the final turn as well. I'm going to play Mockingbird plus Loki, and just getting that Mockingbird out of my hand I think is good before I exchange this for some Loki cards. My opponent has also Loki'd here, and that plus Quinjet allows them to play an Arishem into Bar Sinister this turn, which isn't that scary, but it's annoying that they win by just 1 additional point. However, Rogue off the top is the best thing that we could have drawn. We did have Darkhawk plus Mystique, that could have been good, but now we can just Rogue plus Mystique and double Blob them, which is going to play around their Darkhawks and just be cheap enough that it also lets me throw a little bit more power into Washington, D.C. So I think this is a pretty fantastic final turn, and we'll see if my opponent agrees. They seem unimpressed so far. We could have actually hit the Quinjet so that would have been bad, but I think it was a risk worth going for, or honestly, I don't think I saw the Quinjet. I'll be honest, I forgot that I could rogue the Quinjet by accident. I just got excited at the idea of blobbing a whole bunch because it seemed good against Darkhawk, which is a card that I would like to play around if possible. Turns out my opponent has Blob, which isn't going to be able to beat my double Blob, and they don't put any additional power really into Washington, D.C., so we take him for another 4 cubes. This was a pretty cool one. We both play Nick Fury. Wakandan Embassy leads off the game, and then we get another Wakandan Embassy from Mirror Dimension on turn 4. I play Spider-Woman, and then I rogue my opponent's Ronin. Both of these, oh, and then I also played a Mockingbird, and all 3 of these serve to make my Scar cost nothing for the final turn, which is always fun, and I can play Scar plus Hit Monkey plus Shang-Chi, so I just get to hit my opponent from all angles here. And I think this is one of the most impressive final turns that I've been able to put together, both because it's like a little bit random. I mean, Shang-Chi is a card that we actually play, but Scar plus Hit Monkey just is totally random and all of what Arishem is about. So it was really cool that we were able to find that line and put all that together. One more gold conquest. This time I am snapping with the threat of Professor X against a Destroy deck. I thought that that potentially gave me some powerful options. I was thinking about Professoring on turn 4. I think that that would have been good. There was only one location for me to put it, which was the Dream Dimension, and ultimately I just decided a turn 4 Leech. Disrupting my opponent on the 5th turn, the penultimate turn of the game, seemed really good because when they can't blow up X23 on turn 5, as I talked about, that really limits what the Destroy decks can do. So I thought that was worth playing for. They're going to wind up making a large enough Venom here that we will be able to Shang-Chi that. So that opens up some possibility. Wolverine is going to flop over into Project Pegasus though, and is an 8-power Wolverine, that is going to mean there's only one place for me to drop my Professor. So that doesn't work out, and honestly, could probably just retreat here, but I just decided to stay in it. I figured maybe this is like a 50-50 where my opponent might play, like my opponent right now knows that they've won Dream Dimension. So if they want to just really press the advantage, they play to the location where they're already winning and they just slam down a null or a death. Now they just wind up playing Shang-Chi, that's all they had, they didn't have anything. But I still kind of like the thought process there that if my opponent is already winning one location, they just double down in the location where they're winning the biggest with a null, and then I won't be able to catch them and they'll be able to win 2 locations, because that's what Marvel Snap is all about. So my Mockingbird is able to steal a win in Project Pegasus, and my Shang-Chi is able to blow up a Venom and also steal a win. And with that, my opponent actually decides they've had enough and they don't want to continue the game, so we've won the Gold Conquest. We're going to look at the Infinity Conquest in just a moment. I wanted to throw in one extra game that I played yesterday though on the ladder as well. I thought this ladder game was also really fun and I wanted to show it off, and it's the end of the season, so let's throw it into this video. I get to make what I think is a pretty cool play this turn of Snowguard Hawk into Danger Room, which will disrupt Los Diablos, so Los Diablos won't potentially ruin Danger Room. I get to add a bunch of power into that location, and then if my opponent wants to add power to the location themselves, they risk the 25% chance of their cards getting destroyed. So I thought this was a cool way to play around Ebony Maw, which has a pretty big drawback, but I'm kind of getting around that by subverting the location, and then it's a location that I don't really want to be playing that much into regardless. So kind of thought this was cool. There are a few different options from here. We've got Darkhawk, we've got Blob, and then we also have Shang-Chi and Cannonball. So some definite options for what we can do this game. One thing I didn't really think about is my opponent does have one turn here with the Danger Room down, grids are down, and my opponent can play some cards into Danger Room right now. So they use that to set up for a big blob that's going to shrink my Darkhawk, which is annoying. And also annoying, I can't Shang-Chi or Cannonball that blob. It is safely behind the Danger Room, behind the Ebony Maw. So all I can really do here is blob into Necrosha, and my opponent, having stolen my deck with Loki, is going to Arnim Zola the blob, which is going to shrink my Darkhawk and just be bigger than my blob, which is really awkward. However, I think there is still a saving grace. We've won the Danger Room, and I don't think my opponent is going to battle for the Danger Room on this final turn of the game. So I think we can actually battle here. We can play Cannonball plus Mockingbird, and I think that that is going to be enough that we should be able to win one of these locations. We can also Mockingbird plus Shang-Chi. So we do have some options, but who can pass up an opportunity to Cannonball a blob? So that's what I gotta go for. Plus it's just a little bit more power. So I thought it was strong, and we're gonna play that into Los Diablos so that way I don't get the -2 from Necrosha. I am never playing Cannonball again. I don't own this card. I have said 1,000 times it is a worse Shang-Chi. And here my opponent plays Enchantress, which disables my Darkhawk. Great. But it also disables Blob's can't move ability, and Blob flops into the Danger Room, winning my opponent that location. That was devastating, but still pretty sweet. Let's move along now into the Infinite Conquest, where I'm not going to play any of my cards early on this game. Zero or Rhino, Ghost Rider, Arishem, these are all really terrible cards, and that is exactly why Loki is so fantastic in this deck. I think that there were some people that initially did not see how strong this was going to be, but I mean, Red Guardian's good, White Tiger's fine, but now I just get to exchange this for a hand of all good cards and cheaper, and Loki's fantastic. We already know that. Lokiing for 6 here, though, is pretty good because I basically just get to see half of my opponent's deck for free, and when you're playing Arishem, you're already at an information advantage. What I talked about earlier, because you were playing a bunch of random cards, but now I just know basically my opponent's entire deck. I mean, I know 7 out of the 12 cards. I can kind of piece together the rest, but that amount of information discrepancy game 1 of a Conquest match is absolutely huge. Also, huge is we have Annihilus here, which is a huge centerpiece card and kind of symmetrical, Annihilus just being one of the best cards against Annihilus. So really great to have drawn that here. I'm going to be able to dump a bunch of my hand this turn. Selene, put negative on Green Goblin, grab the Hood, and yeah, just also play Ravona so Green Goblin's even cheaper. This is a really fantastic spread here, and a great start to this game. From here, there's not really anything my opponent can do. I mean, I'm just beating them significantly on the amount of power on the board, and I also have Annihilus. If they have Annihilus, they can win Thunderbolt's Tower, but they can't really win either of those other 2 locations regardless. So they've got to retreat, and we start off with a 2-cube lead. I would have really loved it if we were able to get a little bit bigger of a cube lead here, but it's fine. I wind up playing Martyr into Asgard just to snag an early lead in that location, and then my opponent waves. I'm going to wind up playing Darkhawk into Asgard. That should secure that location, and then Titan, I will drop the Quinjet, which will hopefully allow me to play some additional cards that we draw here off of Asgard. My opponent plays a Selene and a Dakin that they got from Camp Lehigh. Does not seem super impressive. We will be able to Blob. We can Dr. Doom. My opponent hobgoblined me, so I can just Blob and win in Titan. And I didn't feel like there were any ways that I could lose this game. I didn't think that my opponent would stay in for 1 cube. The snap was kind of just like, hurry up, make a decision. I thought maybe they would it would put him off a little bit just by boomer snapping here. But yeah, again, only gonna get 1 cube, so we still got some games to play. I decide to snap as I Leech because Leech does seem really good against my opponent's deck. This is a little bit awkward though. I drew an Arishem Leech and my own Leech, and then I time theatered the Arishem Leech as well. So I'm triple leeched up, and yeah, hopefully Leech is good. My opponent Celine's my Shang-Chi, which is not a huge deal. My opponent doesn't really have any Shang-Chi-able cards that I've seen. Eliath might be Shang-Chi-able, but it's not really Shang-Chi-able. So as far as I know, Shang-Chi is kind of a dead card here anyways. So all I can really do is Leech again. And then to finish it off, I've got kind of a cheeky play where I move Jeff away from Green Goblin so that way I can Arnim Zola it, and then those Green Goblins will be sent back over to my opponent. Got kind of lucky that they decided to sentry into the location that I was planning on losing here. They could have sentried in Time Theater. They still would have lost the game on differential, but there you go. And with that, they've had enough. Then we have got an Arishem Mirror, and I make kind of a tricky, kind of a silly play, but I think it tracks. So on turn 5, I play Shang-Chi into Camartage with priority, knowing that it won't hit anything. But then what I can do is I can play Arnim Zola into Camartage, and because Arnim Zola will trigger twice, it will definitely send Shang-Chi to both of the other 2 locations. Now, this gets a little bit awkward with the fact that I already have 3 cards in Starlight Citadel. However, if my opponent plays a card to Starlight Citadel, then I'll have space to get the Shang-Chi in there. And if they don't play a card into Starlight Citadel, then I won't care about playing the Shang-Chi in there. Hopefully that makes sense. My opponent winds up retreating anyways, probably because I leeched them, and Leech is really good. But I thought that was an interesting play. Maybe there was a better way to play it, but I'm not gonna give up the opportunity to Arnim Zola a Shang-Chi. My opponent snaps here, but I say in it because I've got Magneto, and they've got a bunch of 4-cost cards, Jubilee, Shang-Chi, Nick Fury, that I can probably use to lock them out of one of these locations. Now, the actual reason that they snapped, though, was because they have Living Tribunal, which is going to give them a way to add more power to Great Portal as well as Morag, and probably means I lose if my opponent has Blob or Darkhawk. I decide to stay in it though, and I don't really know why. I did not have a great play this turn. I just didn't feel like retreating and kind of called that my opponent wouldn't have anything here, and they didn't. They have Magneto, but that's not going to be enough to win in Great Portal or in Sakaar, so we take the win. Then is like another pretty mediocre game where I get to snap on turn 5. I've got Leech. My opponent still hasn't really done anything up until this point though, and I'm just playing a bunch of power into Baxter Building while not really having anything that's Shang-Chi-able. This is just a very medium Arishem game where nobody does any of their crazy stuff, and we just play back like bad Marvel Snap cards back and forth, and the one that has slightly better ones wins. My opponent really did not have anything here, and basically it's just a concession. They give up, and we're on to the next match. I leech my opponent on turn 4. That's obviously always a great start, and I played a bunch of mediocre cards into cloning vats early on, so that way I could keep a full hand for Loki. My opponent wound up ice manning my Loki, so I will eventually drop it here this turn alongside a Quinjet, which I'm also just going to add to my hand with the cloning vats, so that way I get a full hand of 6. Again, it's pretty good to Loki on the first game of a match, especially only 1 cube on the line right now, so a little bit of extra information could be worth it. My opponent overcommits into cloning vats, dropping a Hulk alongside their Iron Man, and now I'm thinking my opponent is probably just going to play a Hulk on the final turn and then soak up that extra energy into the Hulk, and they'll probably play it into Washington DC. because they're already battling for that location with Dracula, and playing into Atlantis means that they lose power. They would lose to my Hulk. So what if I just play High Evo into Atlantis? That will win that location, and then play Hulk plus Agent Coulson into Washington, D.C. I could have actually switched these around. I could have played Coulson into Atlantis for 9, which would have won that location, and then get 2 extra points against their Dracula. But my Hulk, importantly, will actually be bigger than their Hulk. They will have a 14 power Hulk from soaking up that extra energy. Meanwhile, I get a 15 power Hulk because mine has no ability. So pretty silly, and now they have to discard something for 15 power to win this game. Actually 14, and they'll win on differential, but they don't have it. They discard a Tuma, and that's just quite not enough. They actually didn't need that much because Hulk got more power, but regardless, we get the victory. We see a pretty low power game on this next one. I thought I was doing some cool stuff with Juggernaut to try to get them into Fisk Tower, and also filling up Fisk Tower so that way none of my cards would get to that location and they would get some cards with negative power. They kind of caught on and did a similar thing though, and they'll be able to win that location easily with Sunspot on the final turn, and I just have to play Agatha on the final turn, so I'm gonna retreat, lose a cube, not a huge deal. I battle for White Hot Room with Darkhawk in the next game, which I felt like was solid because my opponent's not going to be able to overcome that. I haven't seen Darkhawk now in all of these games. I haven't seen it off Loki, so I don't think that they have Darkhawk potentially, and I think that means we've won in White Hot Room. And now with extra energy this turn, there's an interesting option, and I think the play is actually to Leech my opponent. Reason being, because we're going to steal their hand with Mindscape, but I don't actually think that we've seen anything that like really loses that much power by Leech, and with this extra energy I just want to make as much use of it as possible. So I'm going to play out 11 power worth of cards here, snap, and that'll make my opponent retreat. I snapped this game when I threw down Leech, and I thought that was going to be interesting for me, but wound up just not being enough. What was huge here is my opponent had an additional She-Hulk out of Arishem that they were able to sneak into the big house, and was just not able to come up with enough power for that location. I played a pair of cheap Sentinels and then soaked some power into Sunspot on the final turn, but my opponent just soaked up that much more than me and was able to take me for 4 cubes. Then we got a Utopia game, and at this point, I'm actually feeling like Loki is not a good card in this matchup, so I just throw Loki into nowhere, and then my opponent sets up with a Shuri, but we get to play this pretty safe because we can Darkhawk into nowhere, which means my opponent isn't going to be able to Rogue or Shang-Chi it. My opponent winds up using Shuri on Dr. Octopus, which I would have been more than happy if that took my Taskmaster here, because it would have copied the Darkhawk, so that would have been great. We wind up having just enough power that we beat my opponent in the Subterranea because Groot gets that additional power, and then I still get to play Taskmaster and Blob into Utopia. We will be potentially battling for priority here. I mean, most likely battling for priority, so the real risk now is my opponent going to have a Shang-Chi? Can't play around it. If they do, we just have to hope they don't, and they don't. But they're not going to throw in the towel just yet, so respect on them for sticking with it. And also, one thing that I think is really important to note here, I brought up my opponent didn't have the Shang-Chi in the last game. We actually have not seen Shang-Chi from my opponent yet. We've seen Rogue, but we have not actually seen them play Shang-Chi. So for that reason, I'm kind of thinking maybe they're not playing it, and I just decide to load everything into the Nexus this game. Not that I really had a choice. I did not have a Shang-Chi of my own. I didn't want a Loki because I don't really like Lokiing against them, and they had the Infinite, so I needed to come up with a comparable amount of power, and for that I just decided to play everything into the Nexus, and they Shang-Chi me, so it's pretty close still, 3 cubes to 1. So now my opponent has to win the next 2 games to stay in it, and I just have to win one of those 2 games. But my opponent makes a really good play here, does some quick math with Daredevil Vision, and despite, I'm looking good here. I'm winning all 3 locations. My opponent is they've won Wakandan Embassy. They just have to not spend all of their energy this turn, and Sunspot and Cyclops will take over in Wakandan Embassy. So knowing that, my opponent is probably just going to play the Hulk this turn into one of these other 2 locations. It's kind of a 50-50. However, it's a 50-50 where one of the 2 locations gives you a 25% chance to have your card destroyed. So I feel like my opponent is probably going to play it safe and go for Attilan, which means I just play my Darkhawk there and I stay winning in that location. But really, really close match and a great game from my opponent there. GG's. On to the penultimate match, and we've got another Arishem mirror matchup here. I'm snapping with a Rogue onto Super Scroll because I'm about to drop Quinjet, which will make the rest of the cards in my hand and deck cheaper. So I don't want them to have my Quinjet, and the Rogue on Super Scroll preemptively steals their Darkhawks and stuff too. So that seemed pretty cool. I Quinjet over in Throne Room, which is kind of like Rogue protection in that location. Realistically, I maybe should have Quinjetted in the same location as my Rogue, so that way if they try to Rogue me back, they might just steal the Quinjet. That could have been a reasonable play. On turn 5, I think I'm just going to play Arishem into this center location. It allows me to stay kind of competitive while still not taking priority, and then I'll be able to Shang-Chi and potentially battle for Throne Room on the final turn. My opponent winds up Lokiing, and I am just going to play a Patriot into Shadowland, which will just barely grab the win. It'll be 3 points in that center location. I'll play Shang-Chi and Deadpool in Weird World, and then a Hit Monkey over in Throne Room, which will usurp Agent Coulson, and hopefully this battles for all 3 locations in a meaningful way, and we can see it worked out pretty well. My opponent has a Darkhawk to kick things off, then the Rogue, which is why I said I should have Quinjetted center, but it's fine, and it actually is kind of silly because now Patriot gets to pump the Rogue as well, though it won't be enough to be relevant. The only relevant thing here is the Shang-Chi plus the Hit Monkey, and my opponent didn't commit any additional power into Throne Room, so we'll grab the win. This game we've got Westview, which turns into a turn 4 Project Pegasus, which is going to allow me to play Odin on Nick Fury again and get some additional options, though that actually isn't what winds up happening because I play Shanna before I play Odin, and the sequencing here is super important because Snowguard fills my hand before I can re-trigger Nick Fury. However, I think there's some interesting things that I can still do here with Snowguard. My opponent snaps, but I'm feeling good. I'm gonna stay in it because this is one of my favorite combos. I'm gonna Snowguard Bear into Project Pegasus, which is going to give me 12 energy for the final turn of the game. And I'm not gonna need all 12 of that energy, so my opponent potentially gets off better out of this than I do. But what I get to do on this final turn is Shang-Chi plus Null. I was probably being a little bit too cute with it, potentially giving my opponent all of that extra energy, but it seemed sweet, and my opponent's Blob didn't get big enough, so they still had to battle for Project Pegasus too, but they were able to do that, and with a Mockingbird also put enough power into Pet Mansion, so we're tied up now at 6 cubes apiece. I leech my opponent on turn 3 because of Elysium, which is really good, but I'm worried that they might battle for Utopia, so I play Moon Knight before I play Professor X. It discards my real Blob and their fake Blob, so they probably got the better out of that exchange. A little bit awkward, and on turn 5 I actually have a really solid play. I get to dump my hand entirely and turn off Elysium so that my opponent will have a more difficult time dumping their hand on the final turn, and they leech me, but I don't have anything leechable, and I think we're battling well for Dark Dimension here. My opponent has priority right now just as a random 50-50, so I get to Rogue in Dark Dimension, so I feel pretty good about that, and I've probably won in Utopia, so I'm feeling pretty good. I never snapped, though. And I'm glad that I didn't, because this game got really close. Oh, I Spider-Hammed third Loki, by the way. I felt like I put out a bunch of power this game, but I didn't put out that much power on the final turn, and my opponent actually beats me on differential. I win by 12, they win by 13, and Spider-Woman ties in Utopia, so really close game. But my opponent gets the win. This next game starts off good because we can easily win the Abbey, and there's actually a pretty interesting question here because I do have some expensive cards in my hand. And the question is basically, do I want to play Corvus Glaive this turn instead of Domino? I'd keep the Domino in my hand hoping to discard it, and that way I'd have more energy and more time to play these big expensive cards. But I just decided to play the Domino. I really don't want to discard my Darkhawk, and I'm especially glad I didn't discard my Darkhawk when Onslaught Citadel rolls around. My opponent does have the Shang-Chi for that, but I blob in Strange Academy, and then this game actually becomes a 50-50. My opponent is winning by 9 in both of these other two locations. They probably can't catch up in Strange Academy. They might have Rogue, but they don't have Shang-Chi at this point. So it's a 50-50 which one to battle for. I can actually only battle for one of these locations. I would have loved, by the way, if I just had a little bit more time to set up with Cosmo. That was why I played out my Darkhawk a little bit early, because I had Cosmo to protect some of my cards. But now I really only have one option. All I can do here is play Giganto and hope that my opponent doesn't play for the left location, and they don't. They thought I might play for the other one, and no, we had Giganto, so we had to play left, and we take it for 2 cubes, but now we've got to win the next 2. My opponent leads off with the Quinjet, and I also have Quinjet, but off curve. My opponent had the turn 1 Quinjet. Turn 2, I feel like I have to play Agent Coulson and potentially grab a 4-cost card and have that be relevant. Meanwhile, my opponent also has the Coulson, so they're looking pretty good here. And then the third location is World Ship. So it doesn't matter that my opponent had the Quinjet, that's just gonna get destroyed. It does mean that they got to draw an additional card, get to see an additional card deeper into their deck, but I think I've won. If I could snap here, I would, because I get to play Dr. Octopus into World Ship, which should just secure it up, and my opponent probably won't lead out their Darkhawk, and even if they do, we get to Cannonball it, then we get to drop our own Darkhawk. We have everything. I even get to surprise my opponent with the Darkhawk. Not that it mattered because my opponent couldn't retreat and we're in this one for 2 cubes anyways. I wish I could have snapped on this one. That would have just made my opponent retreat anyways, though I guess I would have snapped early enough that maybe it could have caught them off guard. But yeah, just a dominating performance, and now next game wins the match. This is an Asgard game. Interesting decision on turn 3. I could have played Agent Coulson to give myself a little bit more options for the Asgard turn, but it works out anyways. I draw Darkhawk. Rather lucky than good, and now I get to play Darkhawk into Asgard. This does mean I can't protect the Darkhawk as easily. I'm not going to be able to Leech. My opponent, meanwhile, does Leech, but I felt like I had to battle, and the fact that they got the Drax trigger just meant I was going to need to commit more. But then I draw Blob off the Asgard, so rewarded. Now I can play Blob, but I can't Arnim Zola the Blob, so all I can really do here, I can't Leech them back either. That would have been great. All I can really do is Blob, and then my opponent has to have interaction for both Asgard and Oscorp Tower. Meanwhile, I'll be able to just put a bunch of points into Nidavellir. So that is ultimately what I wind up going with. I'm just going to play Zabu plus Leech into Nidavellir and make my opponent have it. They have to have 2 pieces of interaction, and when I see these cards face down, I figure, okay, they've got a Shang-Chi, but they are probably not going to be able to take me here in Nidavellir, so I'm feeling good. Angel shows up. That would have been sweet if that won me the game, but all my opponent has is a Mockingbird plus a Quinjet, so we grab the win. Really really close one there, but now we are on to the finals and we're gonna try to win an infinite border on this Sasquatch. I am, of course, playing for the Sasquatch border because Marvel Snap allowed me to do the community spotlight for Sasquatch last season, and I never got around to winning in Infinite Conquest last season, so now here we are. If we can win this one, then we will have a shiny Sasquatch border to show off. Omega Red was a fantastic draw there because we kind of need a way to win in Sanctum Sanctorum. If I didn't draw Omega Red, by the way, I was playing Khazar into Wakanda to protect against Rogue because we're already protected against Shang-Chi, and this might just become a game of differentials where whoever can put the most power on the board will win because Sanctum Sanctorum is blocking one of the locations. So now that I have Omega Red, my opponent can't reliably Rogue me, and they also can't Shang-Chi me in Wakanda. So I just get to play a Darkhawk and a Blob there. Meanwhile, winning that location will also win me Sanctum Sanctorum. If they rogue and steal the Omega Red, it's not a big deal because they won't steal the spread of the Omega Red because I'll have more power. And if they hit the Blob or something, that's fine too. Final turn of the game, the play is going to be Khazar into Wakanda just for a little bit more rogue protection, and then like Agent Coulson into Atlantis. But that part really doesn't matter. We're just trying to win Wakanda and then by an extension, Sanctum Sanctorum. And we'll get the retreat off of that. That's going to be enough. My opponent realizes writing is on the wall there, so on to game two. We both led with a Quinjet into the center location, wanting to avoid Jotunheim, and that wound up being Death's Domain, which I'm going to use Mr. Sinister to get the win in Death's Domain, and my opponent flips over a Super Scroll, which could be annoying, but then I draw Rogue. So after drawing Rogue here, and the fact that Rogue battles against Darkhawk as well for Asgard, means that I think this is a snap. Next, my opponent plays Thanos, so they're probably winning in Asgard, but they also have their own Rogue. That's even more annoying. We are going to Leech them this turn, but they will draw 2 more cards off the top of the deck. They will also have an additional energy next turn, but that part was crucial. If X-23 landed into Death's Domain, I think we lose this game. If it lands into Jotunheim, then I think it could go either way, but the fact that it landed into Asgard now means that we're going to be able to win Asgard super easily. Or at least, like, that's the theory. But we actually can't win Asgard here. All we can actually do is tie Asgard, which would actually be kind of a terrible play because then we would definitely lose this game on differential. So yeah, we can't actually do anything great this game. All we can really do here is eventually I find the play of Valkyrie and then Supergiant into Jotunheim. And I think this is an okay play. It's not great, to be honest. I probably lose this game, but the important thing here is my opponent has no clue what I could possibly have in hand, and that is ultimately, to bring it all back, I brought this up maybe game 1 of this video, that Arishem, the unknown, the randomness, really going to play into our favor here, as my opponent just being afraid of that is ultimately going to be forced to retreat. And it's a great retreat here from my opponent, but it's one that I definitely benefit from because I think I was just losing that game. Again, we've got Asgard, but we also have Castle Blackstone, which is really tricky because I want to battle for Castle Blackstone. My opponent could also have a Darkhawk, which would mean they're able to win Asgard, but short of Darkhawk, we are going to be able to win that center location. And to be honest, Ronin kind of shows their hand here, shows that they don't have it. Moon Knight comes out, discards their Goliath, and my Thanos gives me Mr. Negative, which is not super exciting. It is interesting because I get to draw more cards from my deck and I get to draw negative cards, and those could potentially be good, having their stats flipped like that. Interestingly, drawing cards increases my opponent's Ronin, so that's kind of silly, but ultimately I think we're in a pretty good spot here. And then I draw a negatized Blob, which is obviously fantastic. Wasn't really thinking about that when my deck got negatized, and I'm just going to throw down Cloak. I feel like that is reasonable kind of mind games. Then they won't know if I'm going to move my Darkhawk or not. It's not really going to be a huge deal because I'll also have a Blob that they could potentially target with a Shang-Chi or a Rogue, but I felt like just the throwing the Cloak down could be a little bit of an interesting gotcha moment here. We still have the additional energy from Castle Blackstone, and now on the final turn we can actually play Death. That's kind of interesting. Honestly, I missed that. Death might be the play here. Yeah, probably was, because I think I just wind up playing Agent Coulson and Scar, which are 3 and 6. Yeah, I should have played Death. Oh, that's really funny. But I will just wind up, I guess, moving the Darkhawk, playing the Blob. It doesn't really matter which way you go about this. And here, my opponent, I mean, I don't know if there was really a way around this. Maybe I could have beaten it with Death, though. Let's see, because if we had put 16 power in X Mansion, no, there's no way that we grab this win here. My opponent has Shang-Chi plus Rogue, so I think that they just have me either way. If we could have had them Rogue my Blob, that's certainly better for me, but they had Rogue plus Mockingbird and then Shang-Chi in the other location, so I don't really think there was a way around that, and my opponent ties it up here for 6 cubes a pop in the final match. In this next game, we see Altar of Death as the first location, which is interesting. It means that we are potentially battling for differential again, and we have Darkhawk and we have Blob. So that's really curious too. Also, my opponent runs out Yellow Jacket, not into Altar of Death, which I think was really interesting. They snap here, which makes me feel like they have a way to battle for Altar of Death. So I play 2 cards into Vibranium Mines, because if I can get more Vibranium than my opponent, I can actually win Altar of Death back from them. So that was the idea here. Vibranium is going to make for a really huge Darkhawk on both sides of the board, so this can get pretty crazy. And then we have TVA come out. So yeah, this one's a little bit dicey. I'm going to wind up playing Nick Fury into the TVA here. My opponent plays Iron Man into Vibranium Mines. And while things aren't looking great for me, this does really open up a possibility for me now, because I can Enchantress that Iron Man. And I think similar situation to what we saw before against, I want to say the Destroy deck, where I had Professor X, but my opponent is winning Altar of Death, almost assuredly, right? So they probably, just to lock up this game, battle for Vibranium Mines, and if they can like dodge Shang-Chi while also playing for this location, that's really, really good for them. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. They're going to let me have the TVA, and this Enchantress on the Iron Man might be enough to do it. They have Swarm. What else do they have? Shang-Chi. That's not going to do it. They were dodging Shang-Chi and playing Shang-Chi, but they didn't dodge the Enchantress. So we get him there for 4 cubes, and now I'm feeling pretty good after a win like that. My opponent now has to win all 3 of the next 3 games. And I've got Loki. I've also got Leech, which means I might not want to Loki, but I think I will want to Loki, so I'm going to play Groot. If I wasn't going to Loki, then I could play Deathlock or Viper first and then Groot, but I think I should just play Groot here into Muir Island, get the most points out of it, because I think my opponent will probably play to Muir Island this turn, if they have like Agent Coulson or something. So I think that this is a good Groot, and I'm probably just going to Loki away my Leech. My opponent does have more cards than me, but I've got a little bit more power than them, so that's kind of interesting. Lechugia, our final location, and this Arishem basically locks it in for me that I definitely want to Loki because that's one of the best cards that we can Loki away. So let's Loki before we draw any of my really good cards. Getting rid of my Leech is a little bit unfortunate, but I get Quinjet and Shang-Chi and Darkhawk, so much better deal than what I had before. Not a huge fan of Uatu here, and there's another really interesting thing going on that I want to keep cards in my hand so that Grand Central doesn't spoil it all for me. My opponent's got a Nomura, which is pretty cool that they set up for that. Nomura they got from the Agent Coulson here. And then I draw another Quinjet. And basically the question here is like, do I want to play anything? I kind of do want to play Quinjet because I do want that in play. But by playing Quinjet, it increases the chances that Grand Central takes my Shang-Chi or my Darkhawk. I really want it to take either my Arishem or even Uatu. That's fine with me because it keeps Darkhawk and Shang-Chi in my hand, and those will be super cheap on the final turn of the game. I can run those out with Quinjet. I can actually play Shang-Chi plus Quinjet plus Arishem on the final turn for 1, 2, and 4 energy. So that's pretty good. My opponent plays a Darkhawk, and Uatu is what we get into Grand Central. So things are looking good. I can go Shang-Chi plus Arishem in Lechugia, and then I can play Darkhawk in Grand Central. And that's what I'm gonna go for. That's basically all we need. Arishem is just enough to beat the Nomura, and then Darkhawk is unbeatable. We have priority, or they have priority, so we have final play here, and I think this should be good enough. My opponent will probably have to make a pretty big play for Muir Island. No, they're going to go for Eliath, which means that they win in Lechugia, but it means that they don't put any power into Muir Island. So there we go, we got him. Darkhawk is going to take it, and yeah, Darkhawk is ultimately victorious over Arishem. Big story this week, but we are on the winning side of it here. Really sweet. That is going to get me that Sasquatch Infinite Border. Hopefully this video was interesting. I'm talking myself hoarse by explaining through all of this stuff, but some people like it, this kind of breakdown of all of the plays. Let me know what you thought of it, and subscribe for more Sweet Marvel Snap. I'm going to be playing Arishem all throughout the season, up to infinite. But for now, here is that sweet infinite border, and that's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.